black magic, heroin, the homoerotic. Who was William S. Burroughs? Born William Surrode Burroughs II in 1914, young William found himself wanting for nothing, as his family had attained considerable affluence. William Surrode Burroughs I, his grandfather, invented a combination typewriter and calculator he named the adding machine in 1888, meant to correct against clerical errors in banking. This led to the formation of the American Arithmometer Company, later named the Burroughs Adding Machine Corporation, and was a monumental success, forging a bedrock of wealth for his descendants to pursue more creative work. Burroughs' father owned and operated the Cobblestone Gardens antique shop in St. Louis, and his uncle Ivy Lee was a publicist for the Rockefellers, showing that writing chops ran in the family. However, despite all this wealth and intellect, Burroughs was a child of his generation, describing his family relations as cold and indifferent, where displays of affection were considered embarrassing. Whether due to the staunch conservatism of the 20s and 30s or the emotional isolation he felt, the young Burroughs developed a fascination with the occult and black magic. In his 1992 autobiography, The Cat Inside, Burroughs recalled a core memory of playing in a public park as a child, witnessing a glowing green stag that he referred to as his totem animal. This obsession with the occult fueled Burroughs' first attempt at published writing, when he submitted an essay entitled Personal Magnetism to his local school paper, the John Burroughs Review, at just 15 years old. After high school, Burroughs was approached by a family friend, A.J. Connell, who was the director of an all-boys finishing school known as Los Alamos Ranch, which touted itself as a place, quote, where the spindly sons of the rich could be transformed into manly specimens. Connell was known for keeping his office plush with alluring scenery, purple mood lighting, and incense, and made sure to check the boys' muscles 6 times a year for growth and development. He was known for little pranks like bursting in on the young men masturbating in the dorms, yelling, "I've caught 'em at it," and asking them if they'd ever played with it till it went off way down deep. Burroughs' time at Los Alamos was brief and rife with experimentation in both drugs and homosexuality, often indulging in the hypnotic sedative chloral hydrate with other young men he fantasized about, eventually leading to his expulsion. He immediately returned to St. Louis to finish high school before enrolling in Harvard in 1932, where he would pursue an arts degree and develop a lifelong taste for all things bohemian. In his first 2 years at Harvard, Burroughs felt profoundly alienated by its majority prep school population. In a mix of frustration and apathy, he said, quote, "If Harvard doesn't bother me, I won't bother Harvard." Much of Burroughs' curriculum influenced the style and subject matter of his writing, particularly a course on the work of Taylor Coleridge, who was known to write on the connections between drugs and creativity. During his summers while at Harvard, Burroughs would work for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, covering local crime, but the frequency of reporting on dead children was a weight too heavy to bear, even for a mind as macabre as his. This pressure and upset led the young Burroughs to frequent a brothel in downtown St. Louis, where he eventually lost his virginity to a prostitute he would ceaselessly patronize. As he got more comfortable at Harvard, Burroughs managed to make a bathtub gin that became a hit on campus due to its strict restrictions of drugs. Against school policy, he kept a concealed .32 revolver. One night, when horsing around with another student, Burroughs placed a barrel to his stomach, only to be swatted away at the last moment, blowing a hole in the wall. This penchant for hooliganism was not limited to Harvard campus, as he would form a strong friendship with one Richard Stern, and the two of them would have many adventures down to New York City, where they frequented the after-hour clubs of Greenwich Village and Harlem. In their adventures, Burroughs and Stern would rub shoulders with the sons of lords and laundresses alike, united across social class by their love for hooch. Despite this lascivious lifestyle, Burroughs was relatively asexual at Harvard, despite a palpable sexual frustration building within him. For a budding poet, Burroughs frequently found himself always saying the wrong thing when it came to flirting. He was even humorously ignorant of the act itself, assuming babies were conceived through the navel, which got him a re education from his friend group, even if it came with some playful ribbing. All this education and miseducation would give Burroughs a backdrop to really find his stride and enter into the literary canon of America. Shortly after graduating Harvard, Burroughs visited Vienna, Austria, curious about studying medicine, but found himself drawn even more to the salacious side roads of the gay underground, where he would engage in frequent flings with the men he'd meet at saunas. During his time in Vienna, Burroughs grew his first beard, a young Jewish woman fleeing from Nazi occupation named Ilse Clapper. The relationship would be strictly business, though, as the marriage was solely for her to gain U.S. citizenship. Little did Burroughs know that World War II would be right on his heels as he returned to the U.S. 1941. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. The nation is united in the call for revenge, and Burroughs, like every other able-bodied man, was drafted. However, his low rank and history of mental health issues left him dejected. His mother pulled some strings with a friend in psychiatry, and they got Burroughs an honorable discharge. While waiting at a local base in St. Louis for the all clear, he met a GI ending his tour and was convinced to move to the Windy City, where he would work odd jobs such as pest extermination. While living in Chicago, his childhood friends Lucian Carr and David Kammerer stumbled into his life by circumstance or black magic, one may never know. When Burroughs discovered they had plans to move to New York City, though, he was once again pulled into its eccentric orbit. Taking his first bite out of the Big Apple in some time, Burroughs struck up a friendship with the fellow beat writer Jack Kerouac. Kerouac had been involved with a woman named Edie Parker, his first wife, who lived with Joan Vollmer in a cozy apartment near the Columbia campus to which she was an alum. Joan had a daughter through a previous marriage with a military veteran, and Burroughs, upon coaxing from Kerouac and their friend Allen Ginsberg, stepped in as a surrogate father to the girl, kindling a romance between Joan and Burroughs that would be sealed through the tips of syringes and pill bottles. For Burroughs, it was heroin and morphine. For Vollmer, it was an over-the-counter amphetamine called Benzedrine. It was safe to say their relationship had its ups and downs. Burroughs' growing dependence on heroin quickly led him to selling junk himself in Greenwich Village to supplement the $200 allowance supplied by his parents in perpetuity. But no amount of privilege or luck lasts forever, and the law quickly began to know Burroughs quite well. The first to bring the badges to his door was his old friend Lucian Carr, who murdered David Kammerer in a fit of rage after Kammerer's sexual advances went unreciprocated. This homicide went unreported by Burroughs and Kerouac, making them legally culpable. Kerouac and Burroughs would go on to process this trauma in a collaboration entitled And the Hippos Were Boiled in Their Tanks, which was published posthumously in 2008 by Grove Press and Penguin Classics. In 1946, not 1 year after moving to New York City, Burroughs would first be arrested for forging a narcotics prescription. He was let out on bond by a joint effort by Vollmer and her psychiatrist, with the stipulation that he leave New York City and be placed under the care of his parents back in St. Louis. However, this was merely a short stop before Burroughs would head south of the border, where the tequila and tragedy would flow in equal measure. Burroughs first traveled to Mexico to shave his first beard, Ilse, finding Vollmer to be a much more fulfilling ruse. But while he was there, Vollmer's Benzedrine addiction spiraled into psychosis, losing custody of her daughter and landing her in Bellevue Hospital. Hearing of this, he immediately made his way back to New York City despite his legal troubles, and petitioned for her release, asking her to marry him, although only in common law, which would also reunite her with her daughter. Despite Vollmer knowing of Burroughs' homosexuality, they conceived a child together, and William S. Burroughs Jr., also known as Billy, was born in 1947. The four of them would be a traveling circus of a family, bouncing between St. Louis, a failed marijuana farm in New Waverly, Texas, and a short time living in New Orleans, where Burroughs' proclivity for taunting the law brought new troubles to his young family. The Louisiana lodgings that his family shacked up in were marked by chaos inside and out. In an excerpt from Kerouac's On the Road, he said the house was a dilapidated old heap with sagging porches running around and weeping willows in the yard. Another visitor, Helen Hinkle, noted how the children were free to roam and relieve themselves anywhere in the house. Joan's daughter developed nightmares in which she would chew on her left arm, leaving it with a notable scar. One night, while driving around Lee Circle in New Orleans, Burroughs was pulled over for a routine traffic stop that would quickly escalate. In his vehicle, police found an unregistered firearm, as well as clearly written instructions from Ginsberg on the distribution of marijuana. With this initial evidence, the New Orleans police got a warrant to raid Burroughs' property, on which they found multiple additional firearms. This stacked up enough charges to get Burroughs threatened with hard time in the infamous Angola prison. But before the trial could commence, him and his family packed up in hysterics and ran south to Mexico, where Burroughs planned to serve out the 5-year statute of limitations outside the reach of the authorities. In Mexico, Vollmer found Benzedrine impossible to find, so she turned to the bottle for comfort. Burroughs' libido returned in full force after his new run-in with the law, and he began multiple affairs with local men. Vollmer remarked on the adventurous Burroughs in a letter to Ginsberg, writing, "The boys are lovely, easy and cheap, costing only 40 cents, but my patience is infinite." The mix of Benzedrine withdrawals and heavy alcohol abuse aged Vollmer way beyond her years, drying out her skin, leaving it wrinkled, and her ravaged nervous system exposed her to a brief polio infection and a temporary limp. It was on a September afternoon in 1951 where Burroughs and Vollmer hosted a small drinking party at their residence. After sufficient sheets to the wind, Burroughs loaded his pistol, announced to the room and to Vollmer that it was time for their William Tell act, referring to the folk hero of Switzerland, known for shooting an apple from his son's head. The apple in this case was a highball glass that Vollmer, in her equally inebriated state, rested upon her head. Burroughs discharged his gun, and Vollmer's life was ended with a shot between the eyes. Upon arrest, Burroughs quickly changed the story to that of the gun firing off accidentally when he was checking it. Conflicting accounts from witnesses caused the trial to result in a minimum sentence for him. This harrowing time resulted in Burroughs penning his first published novel, Junkie, which was released in 1953 under the pen name William Lee. But more importantly, Burroughs felt a corruption in his soul, which he named the Ugly Spirit, showing superstition still pumped through his veins as strong as black tar or whiskey. He felt that writing was the only way he could keep it at bay. He would often refer to this form of therapeutic writing as sorcery, and this sorcery would lead him to producing the most legendary work of his career. By 1953, Burroughs had garnered so many legal and financial setbacks, he had ostensibly become a vagabond. He bounced between Florida and New York City incognito, but after his lifelong friend Ginsberg turned down his romantic advances, he flew out to Rome. After being unenthused by the time he spent with the poet Alan Anson, Burroughs found himself enthralled and inspired by the writings of Paul Bowles and his stories of the international zone known as Tangier in Morocco. Upon setting up shop in the city, Burroughs quickly got enmeshed in the drug trade in Morocco. The majority of Naked Lunch was written in a combined and potent haze of a local marijuana tincture Majoon and the German-engineered opioid Eucadol. This couch-locking concoction set the stage for Burroughs to indulge his imagination and reflect on his first bout of heroin addiction. Originally a collection of stories entitled Naked Lust, Ginsberg's misreading of Burroughs' drug-addled scrawl gave it the title Naked Lunch, and Ginsberg's connection got a few excerpts of it published in the Chicago Review. The student editor at the time, Irving Rosenthal, was a fan of what he read and tried to get more printed, but the publication was halted and Rosenthal fired after a critic in the Chicago Daily News called the excerpts obscene. Rosenthal went on to publish more excerpts on his own in his underground magazine, Big Table Number 1, but this too was halted by the United States Postal Service, refusing to distribute copies due to its growing reputation as a hair-raising, pearl-clutching read. With the feathers of American readers freshly ruffled, Olympia Press, publisher of bold and transgressive literature like Lolita, took a chance on publishing the entire manuscript in France after its initial rejection by City Light Books in the US. After gaining huge critical acclaim and cult following in Europe, Naked Lunch was finally published in the US in 1962 by Grove Press, making it an early contributor to the 60s burgeoning counterculture. This renown did not save Naked Lunch from criticism, however, and new legal battles, as shortly after its publication in the States, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts filed an obscenity case against Burroughs and his publisher on the basis of Naked Lunch's extreme content, which even by modern standards is a gnarly read. In 1966, the Supreme Court finally ruled the novel not obscene, making it the last legal battle over a work of pure literature to stand trial over obscenity charges in the United States to this day. While in Paris awaiting publication of Naked Lunch, Burroughs and friends established what would be called the Beat Hotel that is now a historical landmark. While nothing more than a typical boarding house, it was packed with creatives like Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, and Peter Orlovsky, the whole era documented extensively by British photographer Harold Chapman. It was in these hallowed halls that Burroughs would strike up a lifelong friendship with the Canadian painter, writer, and sound artist Brian Gisson. Gisson's style of painting imbues the same kind of visual chaos as Jackson Pollock, but with more geometry, movement, and intention. Burroughs was enthralled by his work, saying, quote, "I don't think I had ever seen painting until I saw the paintings of Brian Gisson." The style of Gisson would have such an impact on Burroughs that later in his life he'd even dabble in chaotic visual works of his own, with his own style of shotgun painting, in which he would fire upon spray paint cans with his 12 gauge, causing a flamboyant spattering of neon. Gisson's influence on Burroughs did not stop in the visual realm, as Burroughs also adopted Gisson's innovative cut-up style. Similar to blackout poetry, the cut-up technique involves cutting up an original essay, story, or poem line by line and rearranging it to form new literary experiences, forming a collage of prose and pretext. This would profoundly shift Burroughs' ideas of what was possible with literature, and this cut-up style would become a fixture of his writing in the future, with less renowned works such as The Soft Machine and Nova Express. This Beat Hotel, however, would not be an oasis from Burroughs' lifelong obsession with skirting the law and stacking up drug debt. While still in Morocco, Burroughs became friends with and business partners with the English drug smuggler Paul Lund, and Burroughs was directly implicated by Lund in a conspiracy to smuggle narcotics into France. This led the Moroccan government to reach out to French authorities, and new charges were brought up against him. However, since the success of Naked Lunch was so monumental in France, and French culture valuing a literary career so highly, Burroughs was given a lightened sentence, showing once again the angels watching over Burroughs never dropped their guard. The success of Naked Lunch granted Burroughs the equivalent of a $23,000 advance, the majority of which was shot right up his arms. The Beat Hotel was a spot for the spectacles of Brian Gisson's Dream Machine, a device inspired by the menagerie of lights and colors that moved along his eyelids during a sun-bathed bus ride. The Dream Machine was merely one of many methods of tuning in and dropping out, as Burroughs and associates also dabbled in mirror gazing, scrying, trance, and telepathy, all accompanied by mind-altering drugs. Burroughs recounted one time when looking in the mirror that his arms turned to tentacles. All this indulgence may have blown out the fuses for Burroughs, however, as in the early 60s he began a quest to get sober for good, and he reached out to one Dr. Bent in London to undergo a groundbreaking treatment with a drug called apomorphine. Burroughs was so pleased with its initial efficacy that he wrote a letter to the British Journal of Addiction entitled, Letter from a Master Addict to Dangerous Drugs, which is appended to some anniversary reprints of Naked Lunch. But, in the typical Burroughs curse, this fleeting moment of hope was dashed down by demons calling him home. Though his treatment for heroin was successful at times, recovery is a Sisyphean task, and the 60s for Burroughs were ripe with relapses. His first serious stretch of sobriety was brought about when he found out that, like father like son, William S. Burroughs Jr., formerly known as Billy, was on trial for forging narcotics prescriptions in Florida while living with his grandparents. Knowing that due to his history with the law and his notoriety as a drug user, he would be extensively searched by U.S. Customs agents upon his return, he decided to quit cold turkey in order to help his son. This turned out to be a massive pain, as during Billy's trial, an escort to Lexington Narcotics Farm in Kentucky, Burroughs was subject to extreme withdrawals. With every cell in his body screaming for smack, and his son facing serious legal troubles at such a young age, Burroughs was in a level of pain that inspired new essays and works, as he once again turned to writing to avoid the ugly spirit. These works were first commissioned by Playboy, but ended up being published in the Paris Review after Burroughs disagreed with Playboy's ironic content moderation policies. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Burroughs and Billy's struggles with substances would be interlinked, and their estrangement would only deepen. By 1976, Billy had developed a serious liver disease from years of alcohol abuse. Much like his mother, he leaned in on the bottle to cope with the fallout of his brief marriage to a teenage waitress. Billy was privileged enough to be in the 30% survival rate for an experimental liver transplant surgery, and Burroughs would make feigned efforts to visit him in recovery in Colorado in 1976 and 77, but Burroughs described their relationship as anything but warm and caring. However, these attempts at recovery and healing were in vain, as by 1981, Billy was found dead on the side of a road in Florida, succumbing to death by liver complications from his return to drinking and quitting of his medications. In the final years of his life, Billy would openly deride Burroughs, claiming he poisoned his life, and even accused some of Burroughs' friends of molesting him when he visited his father in Tangier during the writing of Naked Lunch. Billy's struggles and eventual death kept Burroughs locked into his addiction for the rest of his life, though this would not stop him from securing a legacy that is enshrined to this day. After returning to the United States in the 60s for Billy's trial, Burroughs was requisitioned to cover the Democratic National Convention by Esquire magazine in 1968. It was during this gig that he would form a lifelong bond with the writer Terry Southern. Their partnership continued into 1972 when they made their first attempt at getting Naked Lunch adapted into a film by the game show host Chuck Barris, but it fell through, only to finally be turned into cinema by David Cronenberg in 1991. Burroughs kept his habit fueled in the 70s by frequent publications in indie magazines, which cemented his cult status among hippies and college kids. He even dabbled in longer form work such as the literary screenplay The Last Words of Dutch Schultz and the novel The Wild Boys. In 1974, concerned about his old friend's well-being, Ginsberg once again pulled some strings and got Burroughs a teaching job at the City College of New York. In the Big Apple once again, Burroughs lived at a renovated YMCA building that he would lovingly call the Bunker. Burroughs was apathetic from the lack of passion in his students, calling them creatively bankrupt, his teaching tenure only lasting one semester. Unfulfilled and wandering once again, Burroughs was reached out to by a fan by the name of James Grauerholtz, who would get Burroughs consistent book tours that would keep him relevant and financially stable for the rest of his life. However, the stranglehold heroin had over Burroughs would keep Grauerholtz occupied, tasked with procuring sources in the underground of every city they visited. Throughout the 70s, the Bunker would be frequented by artists and miscreants of all ilk, some of the most notable being Andy Warhol and Lou Reed. In 1981, Burroughs moved to Lawrence, Kansas, his final base of operations. When commenting on life in Kansas, Burroughs said it was, quote, not nearly as violent and a hell of a lot cheaper. In 1983, he was inducted into the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters. The irony of the institution's clunky acronym surely lost on no one. The poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti remarked during his induction that Burroughs was, quote, proof that capitalist society had a great ability to incorporate its one-time outsiders. In the last decade of his life, Burroughs spent his golden years as feisty and collaborative as ever. His writing inspired the dreamy and obscure lyrics of Michael Stipe, and he collaborated with Kurt Cobain on a sonic adaptation of The Junkie Christmas called The Priest They Called Him. In 1990, Burroughs got in the recording booth himself to do a spoken word album, Dead City Radio, with instrumentals provided by Sonic Youth. He also made a cameo appearance in Matt Dillon's debut cult classic, Drugstore Cowboy, proving that even in his twilight, Burroughs was a multimedia artist with a love for the obscure and the obtuse. By 1997, complications from multiple heart surgeries finally led to Burroughs' death. He was buried at the family plot in St. Louis next to the original William S Burroughs with the simple and clean epitaph of American Writer. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like this documentary, please like and subscribe as I have more coming in the future. And if you're one of those 1% special people who still read, go ahead and subscribe to my Substack. I write whatever comes to mind on there. Much love, stay weird.